Been dealing with the council for a little while, and they've been talking about various things that I had to fix. But for the first time this week, they said that the thatch had to go. Well, actually they said the whole workshop had to go. So now we're taking off the thatch, which is going to be interesting to see what it's like underneath, because that was the whole purpose of this. It was a bit of an experiment to see how it would fare. So in the previous video I spoke about how I've got to take down my thatch workshop. In this video we're going to be exploring how the thatch has performed over time, because that was the whole purpose of doing this, was as an experiment to how the rush fared, how the reed fared, and how my limited skill, well, did it produce a workable result that would last any sort of time. But the reason I did this thatch workshop is because I wanted to do a thatch project for ages, and I wanted to do an experiment to see how things would work, which is why I've used rush on one side and reed on the other side. Now, some of the rush has been up for, I think, 2 years, maybe 3 years. So we're going to see how it fared and see what it looks like as we start taking it off. Now, we've had a fair bit of rain recently. It's winter here in Bendigo, but this top layer feels not exactly, it's not damp, but it doesn't really feel dry either. But if we start taking some of this off and get in underneath here, we can see that underneath, even just the top layer, it is actually quite dry, and it's been doing a great job of shedding the water. But on the outside here, where it's just the gable roof, that's not that surprising. What's going to be interesting is how the gutter, or how the valley, has fared. Well, I've taken off a bit of the rush and I'm already learning some useful stuff. Now, as I'm going back through the layers, some of the rush is incredibly good condition. Like this stuff here is really, really dry. But this stuff here, it feels damp. And what I think this is associated with is the drip lines off the branches. Now, when you start researching, well, geez, that's very dappled light contrast. When you start researching rush, one of the things they'll talk about is how it's important that the rush is able to shed the water. And they talk about the proximity of trees and stuff can cause a problem. Now, our rainfall here in Bendigo is very low. From memory, I think it's around 400 and something mil per year. And kids running around down there. And I thought that with that very low rainfall, even though I've put the thatch workshop underneath the tree, it would be okay. But I wasn't sure, and that was one of the parts of the experiment. Well, it really does seem that these drip lines underneath the branches are a problem, because just that concentrated flow of water in particular spots means that the water isn't being shed from the strands of the thatch quickly enough before it can get to the next layer down, and then the next layer down. And so that damp is penetrating further and further into the rush, which means that it's not going to be very durable. Particularly rush is very prone to rot. And so I'm anticipating that when I get to the valley, we're going to have some real problems. Well, I've just found a really wet patch. Before I really couldn't show you that the thatch was sort of damp to the touch, but here you can really see that it is not just damp, it is beyond that, is wet. Now what I think's happening is water's running down here, it's getting to this little patch, and then it's dripping straight down onto this, which you can see is very wet. And so such a small, it kind of looks like a small thing, but it's made a big difference. And this thatch has been in place for what, I think 2-3 years, and it's actually quite degraded. It's not just wet, it's actually rotting, which is no surprise if it's wet, because rush, if it's wet, rots very quickly. One of the other things I'm finding as I'm taking the rush down is just how much it's loosened up. Even though I was getting these ropes and the tying down of the rush as tight as I possibly could. Like when I was doing the top layers, I was actually using a clamp and 2 ropes. One rope that I would be tying off, and then the other rope which was looped around attached to the clamp, and then pulling it down. The clamps are rated at 400 kg, so that's a lot of force pulling it in. And even so, it's amazing how much the the rush has loosened up. Now I'm not sure if that's because the ropes have stretched over time or whether the rush has shrunk even further, because it wasn't completely dry. Don't know. But that was an issue with it being up because there was a lot of slippage and the rush was settling down, which decreased the pitch of the rush of the roof and made more of a flat area at the top which collected water. So two things that were not ideal. You can see there's quite a lot of movement there, and even though this was tightened up super tight, to pull this in to tighten it up even further. Got most of the rush off the roof. It's a little bit left over, but I've exposed the valley, and now you're going to be able to see how my technique wasn't up for the job in any shape or form. Here you can see how wet that is, and all this it's fluff everywhere from the seed heads that I left in the rush, so everything kind of looks grey, and at times I've looked grey because I've had it all over my hair. But you can see here how wet this is, and see here, look at that. See what happened there? There's the rush, and if I push on it, how it's just breaking up. That is rotted, and so it's completely, that's, you know, cactus. Now I reckon this would have lasted the rest of this winter, and because we're halfway through winter now, I reckon with the dry of the summer, it would have been fine for whatever showers we had during, you know, spring and summer and whatever. But I reckon going into autumn, the rot that's here would mean that sometime next winter, though, if there was rain, there would be seepage through the thatch to the inside of the thatch. And that probably wouldn't appear too much because the inside of the thatch is exposed. That means it can dry out. It would probably mean that there'd be a very thin layer of thatch on the inside of the building that stayed dry and therefore didn't rot, and therefore would probably continue to work. And because the sort of compost-like nature of the rush would be so water absorbent, that even in heavy rain, I reckon that the thatch would continue to do its job for quite a long while, a lot longer than you would think based on the rot. But well-laid thatch is supposed to last a minimum of 20 years, and there is absolutely no way this lot would have. And if you're watching any of the videos on how much work's involved in collecting the thatch and laying the thatch, you know it's a massive amount of work. So to have a roof covering needing to be replaced, maybe not every 5 years, but maybe every 6, 7, definitely every 10 years, that's a huge endeavour. And so my skill wasn't up for doing a thatched roof with a valley. But as you've already seen, the thatch that was on the edges of the roof, on the gable, where the water was just coming down, there it probably was good enough, even with the drips off the tree branches. So yeah, lots of lessons learned, lots of really good lessons learned. But in the next video, I'm going to be going into how the reed has performed. Because that's, it's a completely different material. The way the water flows off it is different, and I used a different technique to form the valley, and I'm going to see if that different technique has worked. So stay tuned for that video. It'll be coming out soon because, as I've said previously, all this has got to come down now. Oh, and just one more thing before I wrap up this video. It's something I've been meaning to mention for a while. I've been doing videos about the thatching. It's very important to keep track of your tools, because I've just taken these 2 bundles off and look what I've found. That's got left up there. So yeah, the blade's knackered, but I'll be able to reuse the handle.